Okay, right. Let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are really plunging into a complex situation. We're focusing specifically on the Kurdistan region of Iraq, the KRI, and looking very closely at, well, a pretty tumultuous period, March through June of 2025. Now, for this deep dive, we've gathered a whole stack of source material analyses, notes, reports, all provided by you, our listeners. And our mission really is to carefully pull out the most important bits of knowledge from all that. We want to give you a clear, detailed picture of what's actually been happening, help you feel, properly informed about this dynamic region that's been under some pretty intense pressure lately. Think of it as your shortcut through, well, all the noise.
And the sources definitely make it clear that pressure has been coming from, well, multiple directions, all at the same time. Throughout this deep dive, we'll be covering some significant security challenges the region's facing, some really crippling economic strains, the very intricate, often quite delicate political dynamics between Erbil, that's the KRG capital, and Baghdad, the federal capital, and of course the involvement of various international and regional players. Our focus, just to be clear, is strictly on the events and the insights that are detailed in the source material you gave us, specifically within this time frame, March to June 2025, though we will need a tiny bit of context from just before that. And just to quickly set the scene, if you're maybe less familiar, the KRI, it's a semi-autonomous region up in northern Iraq. It's governed by the Kurdistan Regional Government, the KRG.
Exactly. That's crucial context, understanding that unique position within Iraq. So over the next little while, we're going to methodically walk you through the timeline, show how things kind of escalated. We'll look at the very real, tangible impact these events have had on the people living there in the KRI and also on the KRG's ability to actually function. We'll examine the role of some external factors, particularly around that vital oil pipeline and U.S. involvement there. And finally, we'll zero in on what the sources suggest might happen at a pretty significant upcoming international meeting that, well, everyone's going to be watching. It sounds like a lot. And yeah, the topics are serious, but we'll make sure it's accessible. We'll highlight those aha moments, where things click together. Keep it from feeling like you're just reading some dry report. Okay, let's unpack this timeline then, because the sources really show how fast things intensified. Right, so to really get a handle on the situation in March, April, May, and June of 2025, the sources tell us we actually need to step back just a little bit, back to January of that year, because January sets this really crucial security context that kind of ripples through everything that follows. The material points specifically to events on January 28th, 2025. On that day, Turkish airstrikes hit alleged PKK positions. These are in the mountainous areas of the northern KRI. Now, this conflict between Turkey and the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which Ankara sees as a terrorist group, it's unfortunately played out across the border inside KRI territory for years, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a persistent source of tension, a real headache for the KRG, trying to manage relations with Ankara on one side, and then groups like the PKK who sometimes operate from within their borders on the other. It's a very difficult balancing act.
So what made the January 28th strikes stand out in the sources?
Well, what makes them particularly significant, based on the reports we have, is a really crucial detail reported by Agence France Presse, AFP. These strikes didn't just hit alleged militant targets, they also hit civilians. AFP specifically reported 4 civilians were killed.
4 civilians, wow.
And the importance there, you just can't overstate it. This single incident, according to the sources, immediately throws a spotlight on a core vulnerability for the KRI and the KRG. It's not just about, abstract security threats or distant skirmishes. It shows how this ongoing conflict between Turkey and the PKK directly translates into profound risk and tragically lethal harm for the civilian population, people caught in the crossfire.
Caught in a conflict that isn't really theirs.
Exactly. 4 civilian deaths. That's not just a statistic. It represents families, communities shattered. It's a stark reminder of the human cost. And for people living in the KRI, incidents like this, they immediately sow fear, instability.
And that fear, it raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? Something the sources implicitly bring up. What does this mean for perceived security and, frankly, the actual security for ordinary people living there when they're routinely impacted by conflicts involving external states like Turkey and non-state groups like the PKK all happening inside their territory? It really challenges the KRG's most basic job, right? Protecting its own people.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely does. It hits at that core responsibility.
Okay, so January set that really challenging security baseline. What happened as we moved into March? Did the sources point to different kinds of threats starting to emerge then?
Yes, they did. March, according to the material we looked at, saw a different, but unfortunately quite familiar, threat resurface. That's the concern about ISIS, the Islamic State. Now, obviously, ISIS's territorial caliphate was defeated years ago, but the sources really underscore that remnants, ideological followers, they continue to pose a threat right across Iraq and into Syria as well.
Still a persistent danger, then.
Very much so. Specifically, the source material, and this references a report by Human Rights Watch, notes an airstrike on March 13th. This strike killed the deputy leader of ISIS.
Okay, that sounds pretty significant, but you mentioned there was a nuance about the location.
Yes, and it's an important detail drawn straight from the sources. The strike didn't happen directly inside the KRI's administrative borders. It actually took place down in the Anbar Governorate, that's in western Iraq.
Ah, okay. So why is it relevant to the KRI then?
Well, the sources present it as relevant for a really critical reason. It emphatically shows that the region's vulnerability to terrorism, particularly from a group like ISIS, is still very real and geographically close. Anbar isn't actually that far from the KRI's southern borders. And the very nature of ISIS, as a network capable of regrouping, launching attacks, it means that even strikes happening elsewhere in Iraq directly impact the overall security picture for the KRI.
Right, the threat doesn't respect administrative lines.
Precisely. It serves as a stark reminder, according to these sources, that the fight against terrorism isn't truly over. And the KRI is, well, intrinsically linked to Iraq's broader security challenges. You can't really separate them entirely.
So even when the big headlines are about things happening elsewhere in Iraq, that underlying threat, the potential for instability to just spill over, it's still very much looming for the KRI. It reinforces that sense of living in a volatile neighborhood.
Exactly.
Okay, moving into April. The sources seem to point to a mix here, some continued local level tensions, but also clearer signs that economic strain was starting to bite, and bite hard, before the major crisis really hit. So April 2025. The source material highlights a couple of quite distinct and concerning incidents. First, on April 1st, there was a really disturbing attack in Dohuk, one of the KRI's main cities. The specifics reported are, frankly, chilling. It was a hatchet attack carried out against a Christian religious procession. 3 people were injured.
And the sources specifically note a link here. The assailant was reportedly linked to ISIS.
Right, so that connects back.
It connects back powerfully to the security theme, yes, but with a specific focus on internal threats and vulnerable communities within the KRI. It really shows how these global terrorist ideologies can manifest at a very local, very personal level, targeting specific ethno-religious groups. An attack on a Christian procession is often intended not just to cause casualties, but to sow fear, distrust, maybe division along sectarian lines.
Undermining social cohesion.
Exactly. This incident, highlighted in the sources, it raises really important questions about the KRG's capacity. Its capacity to maintain internal security, protect its minority populations, and counter these extremist ideologies that can inspire such violence right there within its own territory. It's a different kind of security challenge than the cross-border strikes, more internal.
Definitely. And then, just 5 days later, April 6th, the sources point to a very different kind of pressure building. One that speaks volumes about the state of the KRG's finances, even back then, a teacher strike.
The sources specifically state that teachers right across the KRI went on strike on April 6th. Their demand was clear and unfortunately pretty common in the KRI. Better salaries, improved working conditions.
A familiar story.
It is. And the significance of this event, based on the sources, is critical. It serves as this really stark signal of growing economic pressure before the major salary crisis blew up in June. This strike showed the financial strain was already hitting the livelihoods of public sector workers hard. It was building internally, within the KRG's own finances, its resource management.
So people are already feeling the pinch.
Absolutely. It highlights the frustrations, maybe even desperation of everyday citizens. People whose ability to just provide for their families is directly tied to the KRG's fiscal health, its ability to actually pay its employees. The sources make it clear. The cracks were definitely starting to show, well before June.
Okay, so the economic warning signs were flashing pretty brightly, even in April. Then May offered a brief, though still challenging, kind of detour into environmental issues for the wider region. Yeah, in May 2025, the source material mentions a massive sandstorm, one that swept right across Iraq. The scale sounds significant. Apparently, it caused over 3,700 hospitalizations across the country, respiratory issues, that sort of thing.
And while the sources don't give us specific details on the direct impact of that particular sandstorm on the KRI itself, it's crucial context for the region. These massive sandstorms, the sources imply by even mentioning it, they're becoming an increasingly frequent and intense challenge right across the Middle East, often linked to climate change, drought, environmental degradation.
Things beyond immediate political control.
Right. While it's not a political or security event started by human actors, it's a powerful reminder of these environmental stresses the whole Middle East is facing. Storms like that, they significantly impact public health, they disrupt daily life, ground flights, close businesses, hinder transport infrastructure,
Yeah.
potentially affecting the KRI's capacity to function, its workforce. It's just part of that broader, multifaceted context of stress the region faces. Adds another layer of difficulty.
A stark reminder, yeah, that not all crises are man-made, although environmental challenges certainly compound existing problems. Okay. And then we hit June, and the sources make it incredibly clear. June 2025 is where things truly escalated, became critical, with multiple severe pressures just converging on the KRI, all at once.
Yeah, June is presented as the absolute core of this multi-pronged, compounding crisis for the Kurdistan region. The first and maybe the most impactful event detail is Baghdad's decision to suspend KRG employee salaries.
Suspend salaries, that sounds huge.
It is. The specifics from the sources are unambiguous. The federal government in Baghdad just halted the transfer of funds. The money designated for paying KRG civil servants stopped, and the reaction from the KRG leadership, reported by Ruda, was swift and fierce. KRG Prime Minister Mesrour Barzani was quoted directly. He called Baghdad's decision collective punishment.
Collective punishment, strong words.
Very strong, and the key insight here, straight from the sources and Barzani's reaction, it's the severity and the perceived intent behind the action. Suspending salaries for the KRG's entire public workforce. It's a direct, devastating blow to the KRG's ability to govern, manage its budget, just operate day to day. But more importantly, it's an immediate catastrophe for potentially hundreds of thousands of citizens across the KRI. Those teachers who are already striking in April, doctors, nurses in hospitals, police officers, administrators, suddenly their main, often only source of income just vanishes. Overnight. This action, according to how the sources portray it, represents a major point of leverage. Power being wielded by Baghdad in its ongoing, deep-seated disputes with Erbil over money and authority.
And that devastating blow to people's livelihoods, it immediately had real, tangible social consequences, didn't it? The sources detail that.
Yes, absolutely. The sources explicitly state this decision directly caused widespread protests across the KRI, fueled by that sudden economic hardship, the frustration. And the sources also highlight a deeply symbolic and really impactful social consequence. It led to the cancellation of planned Eid celebrations in Suleimania, a major city in the KRI.
Canceling Eid celebrations, wow.
You really need to try and connect this back to your own life, just to grasp the scale of the impact. Imagine your monthly salary, the money you rely on for rent, food, bills, just disappearing overnight. How would that feel? What would you even do?
Panic, probably. Desperation.
Exactly. Now extend that feeling to potentially every public sector worker in an entire region. The social fabric is immediately under immense stress. Canceling Eid celebrations, a major cultural religious holiday, it's not just an inconvenience, it reflects the depth of the economic despair. The social disruption caused by this political and financial deadlock between Erbil and Baghdad, it's hitting people not just in their wallets, but impacting their ability to observe cherished traditions, find moments of community joy. The sources really vividly portray this immediate, tangible social cost.
Just awful. And then, on top of the salary crisis, June also saw Baghdad raising another really contentious issue related to the KRI's most vital resource, oil.
That's right. The sources mention a second significant event in June, accusations of oil contraband. Specifically, the Iraqi Federal Ministry of Oil publicly accused the KRG of engaging in oil contraband.
Oil contraband, what does that actually mean in this context?
Well, it adds another significant layer of conflict to that already terrible relationship between Erbil and Baghdad, as the sources depict it. Oil exports are the KRI's absolute lifeline, right? They're supposed to provide the vast majority of its revenue. But oil revenue sharing, who controls it? That's been the subject of intense, long-running disputes between the federal government and the KRG for years.
So contraband implies they're selling it outside the official channels.
That's what the sources imply, yes. The accusations suggest the KRG was allegedly bypassing SOMO, that's Iraq's official federal oil marketer, and maybe independently selling oil directly on the international market or maybe even domestically without Baghdad's knowledge or consent. And crucially, without the revenue flowing into the federal accounts in the way Baghdad believes it should. These are really serious accusations from Baghdad's perspective.
And politically useful for Baghdad too, perhaps.
Absolutely. They serve to dramatically escalate the political and legal conflict. And they can be used by Baghdad as justification for actions like, well, like suspending salary transfers or refusing to release budget allocations. It just highlights these deeply unresolved fundamental issues. Who controls KRI oil? Who has the legal right to export it? How should the revenue be shared based on the Constitution or lack of clear agreement? How is it accounted for? These are the foundational issues driving that dysfunctional Erbil-Baghdad relationship detailed in the sources.
Right. And compounding these economic woes, the salary crisis, the oil accusations, there's a third critical point the sources make about June, that persistent impasse over the Iraq-Turkey pipeline.
Yes, the sources are very clear on this. That crucial Iraq-Turkey pipeline, the main artery for getting KRI oil exports to the international market via the Turkish port of Ceyhan, it remained shut down in June 2025. Still closed.
And that closure connects directly back to the money problems.
Directly and profoundly, according to the sources. No oil flowing through that pipeline means the KRI is effectively cut off from the revenue generated by its primary resource. This is a major, arguably the major underlying reason why the KRG is struggling so badly to pay salaries, fund services, manage its economy. And the pipeline stoppage itself, it's a source of intense friction. Not just between Erbil and Baghdad, because Baghdad wants control over all Iraqi oil exports, including the KRIs, but also involves Turkey. The pipeline crosses Turkish territory. Its operation relies on agreements with Ankara. It's a complex, multi-party deadlock with just devastating consequences for the KRI's economy. All highlighted right there in the source material.
Okay, so economic strangulation, political accusations, the pipeline blocked. And just when you thought the picture couldn't get any more complicated, the sources point to pressure coming from yet another regional power. And in a totally different domain this time. Also in June.
It's exactly. The fourth major event highlighted in the sources for June is Iranian cyber attacks. The sources, attributing this report specifically to the Hacker News, reported that Iranian cyber attacks targeted Kurdish officials.
Cyber attacks from Iran targeting KRG officials.
Yeah. And this detail, according to the sources, it's incredibly illuminating because it shows very clearly that the pressure on the KRI isn't just coming from Baghdad with financial and political leverage. It's not just physical security threats like ISIS remnants or the PKK or Turkish military actions. Iran is also actively applying pressure. And this time, it's operating in the digital realm, targeting Kurdish officials through cyber attacks. It indicates Iran views the KRI as, well, a sensitive spot in regional rivalries, and is willing to use sophisticated asymmetrical tools like cyber warfare to exert influence, maybe gather intelligence, potentially disrupt KRG operations.
So it forces the KRG to defend itself on yet another front.
Precisely. It forces them to confront yet another complex, modern threat. It demonstrates, according to the sources, that the KRI is really caught in this incredibly complex web of regional interests, rivalries, and different modes of conflict. And you have to ask, what does this mean for the KRG's fundamental ability to simply operate securely in the modern era, when its digital infrastructure, its key people, are under sustained attack like this?
Wow. So putting June all together, the sources really paint this stark picture. The KRI facing immense pressure simultaneously from multiple directions. You've got economic strangulation, salary suspension, pipeline blockage, escalating political accusations over oil, a critical energy export route cut off, its financial lifeblood gone, and sophisticated cyber threats from a regional power. It truly sounds like a perfect storm, a convergence of severe crises hitting all at once. That's a lot for any government, any society to try and navigate.
It really is an overwhelming combination of challenges.
Okay, so that covers the timeline, gives us that chronological sequence of escalating events January through June. But the real impact of this perfect storm, it isn't just in the headlines or the event lists. According to the sources, it's felt directly on the ground, impacting society, impacting the KRG government itself. Let's turn our focus now to what these security threats, these economic pressures, these political battles actually mean for the people living in the KRI and for the government trying to hold things together, potentially falling apart.
Right. Let's break down that impact as it's described in the source material we have. First, there's that ongoing security impact. This connects directly back to the events we discussed from January, those Turkish strikes that killed civilians, and the April attack in Dohuk targeting the Christian procession.
Incidents that hit close to home.
Exactly. These incidents, particularly the ones resulting in civilian deaths or injuries, or specifically targeting vulnerable communities, they have this profound corrosive effect on public trust, on the basic sense of safety. Citizens living in the KRI are constantly forced to question if the KRG, despite its autonomy, can actually provide basic protection. protection from internal threats like ISIS elements, and from external state actors operating or striking within their borders like Turkey, or influencing their digital space like Iran.
That must create a pervasive sense of unease.
It does, this pervasive sense of insecurity, of fear. It isn't just some abstract geopolitical concern. It deeply impacts people's daily lives, their willingness to invest in their communities, their movements, and, crucially, their support for the government they expect to keep them safe. What the sources imply here is that this potential erosion of confidence in the KRG's ability to guarantee security poses a fundamental long-term challenge, a challenge to its legitimacy, its ability to govern effectively.
It's that foundational element of any government, isn't it? The ability to protect your population. If that's compromised, everything else just becomes harder. Then there's the immense economic and social impact, which the sources tied directly, devastatingly, to Baghdad's decision back in June.
Absolutely. The sources make it crystal clear. The suspension of civil servant salaries by Baghdad in June is arguably the most immediate and devastating impact detailed in this material. This isn't just about government budgets being tight. The sources portray it as an economic catastrophe, hitting hundreds of thousands of families right across the KRI.
We're talking teachers, doctors.
Teachers, doctors, nurses, civil administrators, members of the security forces. People whose entire livelihood depends on that monthly government paycheck. And the sources specifically highlight that crucial public services, the ones everyone relies on, schools, hospitals, are at severe risk of collapsing entirely because the essential staff who run them simply aren't being paid.
And you can immediately imagine the ripple effects, can't you? Based on common sense and what the sources imply about this widespread hardship. No salaries coming in means people drastically cut back spending. Local businesses that rely on civil servants' income, they suffer, maybe close down. The entire local economy starts grinding towards a halt.
And the sources explicitly state that this extreme hardship directly led to widespread protests across the region. And, as we mentioned, that deeply symbolic cancellation of Eid celebrations in Suleimania. It's a direct, painful, widespread blow, hitting people not just in their financial security, but impacting their ability to maintain basic living standards, participate in their communities, observe cherished cultural and religious traditions.
This is gut-wrenching for so many people.
And the sheer severity of this situation, from the KRG's perspective, it's clearly underscored by their reaction. As reported by Kurdistan 24, they formally appealed to the United Nations for intervention.
Appealing to the UN, that feels like a significant step.
It is. It's not a casual step for a government to take. It highlights, according to the sources, just how limited the KRG's options feel when they're faced with this level of overwhelming financial and political pressure from Baghdad. It's kind of an implicit acknowledgement that they may not have the leverage or the means to resolve this crisis just between themselves and the federal government. They're actively seeking external help, maybe mediation, maybe leverage to try and compel Baghdad to release the funds. It really speaks volumes about the depth of the crisis and the KRG's perceived lack of domestic ways to fix it quickly.
Okay. Shifting gears slightly then, what about the political impact of all these converging crises, particularly on that crucial, often incredibly tense relationship between Erbil and Baghdad?
Well, the sources indicate that the combination of the salary crisis and those accompanying accusations of oil contraband have driven relations between Erbil and Baghdad to, perhaps, one of their lowest points in recent memory. The sources really portray a situation where the gap of mistrust, disagreement, outright hostility is widening significantly, making any kind of cooperation incredibly difficult.
But is there any hint of potential resolution, any hope on the political front, according to the sources? The material does mention discussions are ongoing between the Iraqi parliament and the KRG.
Yes, that's a critical detail the sources provide. It's important to note that despite the extreme tension, the channels for dialogue haven't completely shut down. Discussions are reportedly happening between representatives from the Iraqi parliament and the KRG leadership.
So they're still talking, at least.
They are still talking. However, the source is very clear and adds that crucial dose of realism. No agreement has been reached yet. As of June 2025, deadlock. This persistent, unresolved deadlock is presented as the core political challenge that's underpinning so many of the other crises. It's this failure to reach a political agreement on fundamental issues, budget transfers, oil revenue sharing, the KRG's financial entitlements, that directly prevents resolving the devastating economic issues, like the salary payments.
Politics is blocking the economics.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here, as highlighted by the sources, is that you have dialogue channels existing alongside these incredibly damaging actions like the salary cuts. It just speaks to the complex, deeply interdependent, yet profoundly conflict-ridden nature of the Erbil-Baghdad relationship.
Yeah.
They kind of have to talk, but they seem completely unable to agree on anything substantive.
A very difficult dynamic. Finally, what about the international image impact of all this? When the KRG appeals to the UN, when these crises make international news, how does that change how the world sees the region, its position?
Well, the KRG's decision to appeal for international support, particularly to the UN, as Kurdistan 24 reported, and the sources noted, it definitely increases its global visibility. It puts the severity of the challenges it faces squarely onto the international stage.
Which should be good for awareness.
Right, good for raising awareness, potentially garnering sympathy, maybe calls for mediation. But and this is a significant but, you can draw from the overall picture in the sources, it also starkly exposes the KRI's vulnerabilities, its precarious position. It shows the KRG is heavily impacted by pressures from Baghdad, yes, but also from neighboring countries like Turkey and Iran, countries willing to use various means, military force, cyber attacks within or against KRG territory or officials.
So it highlights their dependence or vulnerability to external forces.
Exactly. It highlights, according to the sources, the KRI's very delicate position on the regional and global stage. It exists in this kind of gray area, not a fully independent state, highly susceptible to the often competing interests and actions of multiple powerful external actors. If you connect this to the bigger picture presented, the sources suggest the KRI's fate is tied not just to its internal governance, its political will, or its relationship with Baghdad, but it's deeply intertwined with the complex, often challenging interests and actions of Ankara, Tehran, Washington, and others playing out in the region.
Right. So pulling together all those threads from the source material, what does it all mean? The sources paint this clear, concerning picture. A society, a government under immense multifaceted strain. Security fears are persistent, varied, hitting civilians, minorities. Economic hardship is acute, hitting everyday citizens devastatingly hard through the salary crisis, the pipeline blockage. And political fragmentation, unresolved, deep-seated disputes with Baghdad and powerful neighbors. They're making finding any lasting solutions incredibly difficult. It's a truly tough environment for everyone involved.
It really is. A deeply challenging picture emerges.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit now and look more closely at one significant external actor,
Right.
specifically mentioned in the sources and their involvement concerning that crucial oil pipeline we talked about earlier, the United States.
Right, the Iraq-Turkey pipeline. As we've established, and as the sources strongly imply, it's absolutely vital for the KRI's economy. Its continued closure means the region simply cannot export its oil, which was its primary source of revenue by a huge margin. The economic pain, the core financial struggles of the KRG, including that inability to pay salaries, it's directly and fundamentally linked to this pipeline stoppage. Restarting it is essential for the KRI's economic survival. But as the sources show, it's caught up in this complex legal, contractual, political dispute involving multiple parties.
And the sources mentioned the U.S. got actively involved in trying to resolve this relatively early in 2025 before the June crisis really peaked.
That's correct. Specifically, the sources, attributing this report to Reuters back in February 2025, noted that the United States put significant pressure on the federal government in Baghdad regarding the pipeline.
Significant pressure. How so?
Well, the nature of this pressure was quite strong. The U.S. reportedly threatened sanctions on Baghdad if oil exports via that pipeline didn't resume.
Threatening sanctions. Okay, that's serious leverage. Why would the U.S. take such a strong stance? What's their interest here?
The sources provide the rationale. They frame Kurdish oil exports not just as some local Iraqi issue, but as a strategic issue. Strategic for regional stability and potentially for global energy markets. It's clearly in the U.S. interest, according to this perspective presented in the sources, to see the KRI exporting oil again. Why? Well, first, to prevent further economic collapse in the region. Economic collapse can easily breed greater instability, right? Potentially creating space for groups like ISIS to resurface or gain strength.
So a stability concern.
A major stability concern. And also, in a world of volatile energy prices, having more oil supply on the market, even from the KRI, can be seen as contributing to global energy security. So, stabilizing the KRI economically by restarting oil flows and contributing to global supply, these were presented as clear strategic priorities for Washington, justifying that pressure on Baghdad.
Okay, so clear U.S. strategic interests, strong pressure applied back in February. But despite that, the sources, looking at the situation in June 2025, confirm still no progress. The pipeline remained closed.
Exactly. The sources, citing a report from the Washington Institute in June 2025, confirm the current status. The pipeline is still stalled, shut down. And the reasons given for this persistent stoppage point directly to these complex, unresolved disagreements over payments and contracts.
So the U.S. pressure didn't work.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting, based on the sources. And it reveals something important about regional dynamics, I think. What's fascinating here is the apparent limits of even significant U.S. influence. The U.S. clearly had strong strategic interests. They applied what sounds like significant pressure, threatening sanctions. Yet, as the sources reported in June, they were running up against these complex, deeply entrenched political disagreements, legal battles, contractual disputes between Erbil, Baghdad, potentially Turkey-involved companies.
Just too messy.
It seems so. These issues, arguments over who controls revenue from oil already exported before the shutdown, how future revenue should be shared under old or new agreements, disputes over transit fees charged by Turkey, they've just proven resistant to external pressure alone, at least by June 2025. This situation, as described, it raises a really important question for anyone watching the region. How effective can external pressure really be, even from a powerful global actor like the U.S. with clear strategic goals? How effective can it be when the underlying internal political will to compromise, to resolve these complex, multi-party disagreements seems to be fundamentally lacking between the key regional players like Erbil and Baghdad?
Yeah, it suggests these local disputes have this powerful, almost immovable inertia of their own that external pressure struggles to overcome.
That seems to be the implication from the sources, yes.
It really does underscore just how tangled and difficult this whole situation is. Even a powerful player like the U.S., with clear strategic reasons to get this pipeline flowing, stabilize the region, finding it incredibly tough to cut through the complex political, legal, contractual knots that have brought it to a standstill for months.
A very stubborn problem.
Okay, finally, the sources point us towards an upcoming international moment, one that everyone who follows the KRI in Iraq will be paying close attention to. An Assembly General, specifically a meeting scheduled for June 20th, 2025.
Right. Based on the source material and the context of how Iraq discussions usually happen at the UN, this scheduled meeting almost certainly refers to a planned session of the UN Security Council, specifically focused on the situation in Iraq. The sources, citing the Security Council report, confirmed such a meeting was planned for that month.
And who's expected to be briefing the council?
The sources indicate the UN Special Representative for Iraq, Mohammed al-Hassan, is expected to report. His role is precisely that: brief the Security Council on the overall situation in Iraq. And given everything we've just discussed, the security incidents, the devastating economic crisis around salaries in the pipeline, that deteriorating Erbil-Baghdad relationship, his briefing is undoubtedly going to include a significant focus on these recent tensions and crises in the Kurdistan region. It has to.
Makes sense. So given everything we've just unpacked from the source material, the timeline, the impact, the external factors, what are the key things, the probable points of discussion, we can expect to be raised at this UN Security Council meeting on June 20th, based on what the sources provide.
Well, the sources outline 3 primary points that are highly likely to be on the agenda, stemming directly from the crises we've detailed. First, the critical state of Erbil-Baghdad relations. Especially right now, in the immediate wake of the severe salary crisis, Baghdad's oil contraband accusations, the ongoing political deadlock, the Security Council will likely be briefed on the extent of this breakdown, the humanitarian implications of the salary suspension, and perhaps discuss how the international community views this dynamic, or there's maybe a potential role for UN facilitation, dialogue, de-escalation, that sort of thing.
Okay, Erbil-Baghdad relations, what's second?
Second, the significant economic challenges facing Iraq overall, but with the blocked KRI pipeline being a prime, high-profile example. The economic hardship across the KRI, its potential for wider instability. These are issues of concern. Will the UN discussion bring any new momentum here? Maybe by highlighting the international implications of the energy export disruption, the economic collapse risk for regional stability, or perhaps encourage efforts to resolve those complex contractual and payment disputes holding up the pipeline. It's a key economic choke point.
Right. And the third point?
And third, the broader issue of regional stability as it relates to Iraq and the KRI specifically. That backdrop of persistent security threats, pressures from neighboring countries like Turkey and Iran. We saw it with the Turkish airstrikes, the reported Iranian cyber attacks targeting officials, the ongoing threat from ISIS remnants. It's always present. The UN Security Council will likely address how the KRI's delicate, vulnerable position caught between these larger regional powers and their competing interests impacts the overall stability of Iraq and the wider Middle East. The sources imply these regional pressures are just integral to understanding the KRI's current predicament.
Okay, so those 3 key areas seem likely. But the sources also wisely add a crucial dose of realism, don't they, about what these kinds of high-level international meetings often actually achieve.
Yes, that's an important caveat included in the sources. It really tempers expectations. The material suggests that while these types of UN meetings are vital for putting issues on the global agenda, raising awareness, they often result in statements. Statements condemning actions, expressing deep concern about the humanitarian situation, calling for dialogue and de-escalation, rather than producing immediate, concrete solutions, especially for deeply entrenched domestic political standoffs, economic crises driven by internal disputes, or complex regional rivalries.
So more talk than action, potentially.
Potentially. While the KRG is undoubtedly hoping international attention will lead to external pressure on Baghdad, or maybe mediation, the likely outcome, according to this realistic assessment in the sources, might be more about formally acknowledging the severity of the situation, placing it on the international record, rather than providing a sudden breakthrough to actually resolve the crises. And this raises an important question for anyone observing. What is the true power, the practical influence of international bodies like the UN Security Council in resolving these deeply complex, multi-layered domestic and regional disputes, like those facing the KRI right now, especially when key internal parties seem unwilling or unable to find compromise?
Yeah, it really does seem like while the international stage provides that vital platform for the KRG to voice its concerns, highlight its plight, seek attention, the sources suggest the actual lasting solutions to these fundamental issues probably need to come from within Iraq itself, from dialogue, from compromise between Erbil and Baghdad. As incredibly complex and difficult as that prospect appears right now, given such deep mistrust and competing interests.
That seems to be the underlying message, yes. The internal dynamic remains key.
Okay. So we've completed this deep dive into the period March to June 2025 in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Drawing directly from the source material you provided, we've walked through that timeline of escalating security incidents, Turkish airstrikes tragically impacting civilians, localized ISIS-linked attacks, reported Iranian cyber threats targeting officials, showing pressure from multiple directions. We've examined the devastating immediate impact of the salary crisis on everyday life, hitting hundreds of thousands of families, jeopardizing critical public services. We've looked at the intense political standoff with Baghdad over oil revenues, control, governance, fueled by accusations, mistrust. We've explored that tricky dance with external actors like the U.S., regional powers like Turkey and Iran, particularly concerning that vital stalled oil pipeline strangling the KRI's economy. And finally, we consider the role and the potential limits of international attention, even at the highest level of the U.S. Security Council.
The source material, taken together, viewed as a whole, it certainly paints a clear, stark, and deeply concerning picture. A region facing immense interconnected compounding challenges. Security threats persistent, varied, military, digital. Economic instability is acute, severe, hitting citizens directly, devastatingly. Political fragmentation, deep-seated mistrust, unresolved disputes with Baghdad and neighbors. They're all combining to create this very difficult, volatile, uncertain environment for the KRG and their people. It really does feel like pressure from every single angle.
It really does. But the sources also mention, almost quietly in one section, the continued resilience of the Kurdish society amidst all this, continuing to navigate these storms, fight for its place, its rights within Iraq. That's a powerful thought, isn't it? To hold on to amidst all this difficulty and complexity.
Indeed, but understanding the multitude, the interconnectedness of these pressures, that is absolutely key to grasping the reality on the ground in the KRI in mid-2025. It's not just one problem, like ISIS or an economic downturn or a dispute with Baghdad in isolation. It's a confluence of multiple severe forces, military, financial, political, legal, environmental, digital, applying pressure from seemingly every possible direction simultaneously. That's what makes the situation so critical.
Exactly. It makes you step back and wonder, doesn't it? Looking at this incredible complexity, the interplay of these deep internal issues between Erbil and Baghdad, and then the constant external pressures from multiple regional and global actors, here's something maybe to chew on. Is the future trajectory, the ultimate stability of the Kurdistan region of Iraq more dependent on the internal political will? The will of Erbil and Baghdad to finally find genuine, lasting compromise on fundamental issues like oil revenue sharing, budget transfers, governance, or are the external pressures, the regional dynamics from powerful actors like Turkey, Iran, even the limits of U.S. influence, are those ultimately the deciding factors in the KRI's long-term fate? Something to think about after this deep dive into the source material. Thanks for joining us. We hope this has given you a clearer, much more detailed picture of a truly complex and challenging situation, helping you feel significantly more well-informed about the KRI without getting lost in, well, all the information overload out there.